This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship.
About engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. Today we're going to focus on Venezuela, one of the most significant and confusing, I think, crises of our current moment, but a crisis in a region of long-standing American intervention and conflict, a crisis in a region that has gone through extraordinary changes over the last 250 years, and a region where the United States and its relations with Venezuela and other countries have always been not just complicated, but often quite controversial. We are fortunate to be drawn to this topic, not only because of the prominence it has in the news, but because we have a colleague who I think is one of the most interesting scholars writing on the region as a whole, who has a lot to share with us today. This is my colleague and friend, Professor Kurt Weyland. Kurt, thank you for joining us.
Yes, happy to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Kurt has been with us before. He is the Mike Hogg Professor in Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. He's conducted original research in virtually every place one can go in South America: Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, and Costa Rica, Peru, Venezuela. Professor Weyland is the author of 7 books. All of them are worth reading. I'm going to just name some of my favorites. Making Waves, Democratic Contention in Europe and Latin America, which is really, I think, a model of comparative politics. Assault on Democracy, Communism, Fascism, and Authoritarianism during the interwar years. And then most recently, I believe, Democracies, Resilience to Populism's Threat. So Kurt has a strong background in the history of the region and the dynamics of democracy, authoritarianism, and intervention in this region. Kurt, I imagine you've been very busy with Venezuela in the news so much these days, yes?
Yes, that was really a surprise, this intervention, and the situation is so fluid that, we have to pay attention every day to what new things are happening. So yes. A lot of interest in that topic.
It's extraordinary. As scholars, we need to continue to study the past, but also keep up with the present. It gets quite difficult after a while, doesn't it?
Absolutely, especially because a lot of the situation in Venezuela and the decision-making in the U.S. is quite murky. We don't really know, why Trump did this whole thing. Both sides are playing strange games. We don't know how the opposition in Venezuela will try to get into the game. So, a lot of moving parts here.
Absolutely. We're going to talk about all of that. I wanted to open today by just reading the key section from President James Monroe's annual address to Congress in December of 1823. So more than 100 years ago. Actually, no, 200 years, more than 200 years ago. I'm going to have to work on my math here. This is the key passage written, in fact, by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, that becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine. It wasn't known as the Monroe Doctrine initially, but it became over time known as the Monroe Doctrine. And what Monroe said was that we, the United States, owe it to candor and to the amiable relations existing between the United States and those European powers, he means the European powers operating empires in Latin America, we owe it to declare that we, the United States, should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere. But with the governments who have declared their independence and maintained it, and whose independence we have, on great consideration and on just principles acknowledged, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States. What it seems to me President Monroe was saying in this somewhat flowery language was that the United States would do all it could to make it difficult to not recognize, to hinder European powers from returning to colonies that they had lost in countries like Argentina, Colombia, and Venezuela in this period of revolution and independence in the early 19th century. But it seems to me Monroe is not saying that the United States will necessarily intervene militarily. Kurt, how do you, as a scholar of this region, think about what the Monroe Doctrine meant for the next 200 years, bringing us to today? I know it's a big question, but I'm curious your reaction to it.
So you see various elements in that statement. I mean, you can read it from a more realist perspective. The United States, as even then most powerful country in the Western Hemisphere, is trying to keep competing powers out of the hemisphere. It sounds, in, as you say, its flowery language, in some sense more from an idealist perspective. We, the United States, thrown off the yoke of colonialism, don't want the yoke of colonialism reimposed on our Latin American brothers and sisters. And, as you say, I mean, the Spanish and Portuguese would have liked to reimpose colonialism, and the French and Brits might also have wanted to get into the game. And so the way it reads, in some sense, is, quite idealistic. We want to protect the liberty of those countries. And what you see, of course, in the subsequent 200 years, a lot of shift, in some sense, more with the increase in American power, especially after the Spanish-American War, and then the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, where the United States appointed itself as the policeman of the Western Hemisphere. You see, in many ways, the realist aspect predominate. Then, of course, also kind of the economic, we want to keep competitors out in a number of crises in the early 20th century. But every once in a while, that idealist aspect also came to the fore, with President Wilson in the early 20th century, with JFK and the Alliance for Progress for years in the early 1960s with Jimmy Carter. And so you see United States foreign policy has always been shifty between a more realist focus, more the idealism. And I think you see that in the posture of the US vis-a-vis the Western Hemisphere.
That's very helpful, Kurt, and insightful, and in a sense recapitulates one of the classic ways of seeing U.S. foreign policy toward this region, which is a constant tension between, as you say, realist, materialist impulses and idealistic, perhaps even democratic impulses. And you can certainly see both in the Monroe Doctrine. You mentioned the Roosevelt corollary, of course, from 1904, which is Theodore Roosevelt's more aggressive contention that the United States has a right to intervene in countries that are misbehaving or are mismanaged. On the idealistic side, though, this intervention in Venezuela, how would you characterize it? Is there any idealism in it? Is it a complete rejection? Has the Trump administration gone entirely in the materialist direction? How do you think about and understand, based on the little we know so far, of what the United States is doing in Venezuela right now?
I think you see precisely that strange mixture of different facets in that recent Venezuela intervention, and maybe less in the motivations of President Trump, which are hard to figure out. Because on the one hand, this is, if you wish, clear assertion of American predominance in the Western Hemisphere and concern that the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranis have been messing around there. And this is the so-called backyard of the United States. So get out in that realist kind of spirit. You see President Trump then afterwards highlighting oil, kind of from an economic materialist. We need our fingers on important natural resources. But there is a clear idealist element in there as well, which is Maduro was an awful, repressive, corrupt dictator who had blatantly stolen an election in mid-2024. So while that was probably not the motivation that drove President Trump, Maduro certainly deserved his fate. And he was not, he was a target that, similar to Manuel Noriega in Panama in 1989, clearly had committed so many misdeeds that an idealist would be happy that the guy was removed. And what is interesting there is, which is what I really have struggled with thinking about, is from President Trump's perspective, I still don't completely understand why he would have done it. He has that urge to assert American predominance, but I wonder to what extent this was also driven by the agenda of Marco Rubio. And Marco Rubio, of course, has been at the forefront at combating the left-wing axis of evil in Latin America, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and especially Cuba, where he has family background. And that is more of a regime change, if you wish, democracy promoting agenda. And so I wonder to what extent this was not only Trump asserting predominance in terms of motivation, but also Rubio pushing that regime change agenda, partly in light of the upcoming presidential succession in 2028, where he might want to put his chips into the game. And so I think you might see precisely that strange mix of kind of Trumpian realism and Rubio regime change, maybe not idealism, but, clearly trying to get rid of these left-wing dictatorships.
That makes a lot of sense. Zachary has joined us now. He had some computer glitches, but we're glad you're with us, Zachary. Please.
Yeah, I want to ask, clearly with the historical background of the Monroe Doctrine, and there was a corollary, there was a lot of precedent within that framework and beyond it for American intervention in Latin America. But is there precedent for the kind of a targeted intervention that we saw in Venezuela this month? Is there precedent for this kind of, targeted arrest or kidnapping, however you want to see it, of a leader of another country? Or is this a sort of unique kind of operation that the United States engaged in?
So this is an interesting question, and I think I would like to make several points on it. I think the case that is most similar in early American intervention in Latin America is the case of Manuel Noriega in Panama in 1989, when you also had a ruthless, brutal, corrupt dictator who defied the United States. And the United States, in that sense, did a less surgical strike by actually invading Panama at good cost of civilian lives and taking over the whole country, and then actually instituting democracy afterwards. So the target in Panama in 89 was quite similar. Some, just awful dictator who clearly deserved to be put on trial. In the Venezuelan case is different because it's obviously not a full-scale invasion, but that very, very surgical strike. But so there is a precedent in terms of the target, and you see in the avoidance of a full-scale invasion, President Trump's concern about getting dragged into regime change, potential trouble and turmoil, domestic conflict that could drag the United States into what the Trumpians would call nation building a la Afghanistan and Iraq. And so there is a similarity in the target, but there's also a different approach in doing this in a much more targeted way, which of course has, if you wish, the disadvantage that you decapitated autocratic, corrupt, repressive regime, but most of the power structure of the regime is still in place.
That's what's striking to me, Kurt, that this has been certainly a change in the president of Venezuela. The vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, has taken over at least as interim president, but it doesn't seem like much else has changed. Yet at the same time, President Trump is claiming that he's running the country from the United States, claiming that oil will come to the United States, and yet there has been no new investment in oil infrastructure, no commitments of investment. And of course, one of the problems in Venezuela is not simply who's in charge, it's that the infrastructure to extract the oil is so decrepit that's also kind of shut itself down. So what has changed, if anything?
So in terms of the domestic power structure, very, very little has changed. And you see a very strange, kind of totally unlikely, but ultimately from a pragmatic perspective, logical accommodation between right-wing imperialist Trump and left-wing anti-imperialist Delcy Rodriguez. Because Trump, to avoid the United States from getting dragged into Venezuela, a la Afghanistan and Iraq, in some sense, has an interest in maintaining stability, and the established regime is so firmly entrenched that they have a higher chance of maintaining stability than if you had a democratic transition with all the potential trouble and turmoil. So in terms of the domestic power structure in Venezuela, very, very little has changed. But I think what will change is the foreign policy orientation of Venezuela. Essentially, if the United States takes over oil, then it won't go to China anymore. And clearly, the United States will push for Venezuela to sever its links with Russia, with Iran, Hezbollah, all these kinds of things. And the United States will, in a kind of semi-colonial way, look over the shoulder of Delcy Rodriguez and make sure that in foreign policy she aligns with the US and not with countries that are enemies of the US. And I think one of the most important reorientations of Venezuelan foreign policy would be, and that speaks again to my point about Rubio, cutting off Cuba from Venezuelan oil, right, and putting an even bigger stranglehold on Cuba and really trying to, if not suffocate that regime, just push them to the wall and force them to come to an accommodation with the United States. And so I think there will be a significant shift in Venezuela's international alignments in foreign policy. And from Trump's perspective, he doesn't care about democracy, he wants to avoid turmoil at all costs. That makes a lot of sense, right? You decapitated the regime, you put the gun to their head, and now they will have to do your bidding.
So I see the logic of that, but the historian in me, Kurt, asks if that's really possible. I mean, this is a regime that has many different factions, as all regimes do, right? We know Rodriguez doesn't command the same authority with some of the institutions, particularly the military, that Maduro and Hugo Chavez did. And of course, the Chinese and the Russians are not just going to sit back and watch this, right? They're trying to bribe and threaten their own allies, and the Chinese have a major presence on the ground. Isn't the effort to do what you just said from a distance, from the United States, as you say, acting as a kind of distant colonial overseer, isn't that likely to lead to factionalization, internal fighting in Venezuela, and something that becomes quite disorderly that the United States either has to get involved in directly or ignore?
That is certainly a possibility, and that is one reason why I'm surprised that Donald Trump did this, because there's a risk that Venezuela could descend into internal strife and conflict, and that somehow or other that could draw in the United States, and that's of course what Donald Trump wants to avoid at all costs. So this is a possibility. But I think when you think from the great powers that Trump wants to push out of Venezuela, what I think is much more likely, not that the Chinese and the Russians, not to speak of Iran, are going to take a stand in or about Venezuela, but that this is essentially they will find compensation in their spheres of interest. And so what you see is that the whole Trumpian approach to international relations is kind of Stone Age realism. Great powers have their spheres of influence, and they can do inside their sphere of influence as they wish. And so I think how should I say that, what China and Russia will get out of that is Trump's acquiescence in them taking more control of their spheres of influence. And I think you see that with Trump's accommodation of Russia in the Ukraine war. I don't know what it would exactly mean for China and the South China Sea and vis-a-vis Taiwan, but I think kind of the game among the great powers will be less that China and Russia will fight tooth and nail to maintain a stake in the US's backyard, the Western Hemisphere, but that they will say, well, you did this in your own sphere of influence. Now we have a freer hand in our sphere of influence. I think that's how that will work. And as regards the domestic power structure in Venezuela, I would assume that Trump knows about his own severe attention deficit disorder, that he couldn't pay attention to Venezuela very much. But I think he's probably going to appoint kind of an informal viceroy in ambassador in Venezuela. I bet the American embassy in Venezuela is going to swell to hundreds of people who will keep an eye on things. And the factions that are more radical and that are more, have much more control of the organs of coercion in Venezuela. The defense minister Padrino and Diosdado Cabello, who controls these thugs and goons and militias, the so-called colectivos, I think they will know that if they mess around too much and they cause too much trouble, they might get yanked out and put in the prison cell next to Maduro. And so I think they will have to swallow a lot of what you call in Latin America, swallow a lot of toads and hang low for a while. They will, of course, hope that the Trump administration will move on. I think in many ways, what the Venezuelan power structure is doing is what the wolf did in the fairy tale of Little Red Riding Hood. They're eating a lot of chalk and like, hey, we can play a game. And of course, they're hoping that Trump moves on, that the United States can't actually control what's going on, and that sooner or later they can reassert their control. They can, they can get their fingers again into the contraband, into the corruption, maybe not the drug trafficking as they did before. I think that's the game that is being played. And in some strange way, it serves Trump and it serves that Venezuelan power structure. And who is left out in the cold is the Venezuelan opposition.
Right. And the Venezuelan people, it seems.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, that is the big tragedy in all of this, that the Venezuelan people have suffered an unprecedented catastrophe and who are yearning for some kind of turnaround and who had the courage to vote, 2/3 against the dictator in rigged elections in 2024, still will have to wait for, a significant new start.
Yes. Zachary?
What about the larger international reaction, not just the potential for Russia and China to use this as a sort of prerogative to be more aggressive in their own neighborhoods, if that's even possible, but the American relationship with our allies? Has this moment, you think, further strained America's relationship with its allies? Is there a possibility at all for cooperation with American allies in Venezuela? Not just allies in Europe, but also allies in Latin America?
The reaction has, in some sense, been surprisingly muted because, on the one hand, this is a broad reassertion of American power predominance, if you want to use the term imperialism. But the reaction has been surprisingly muted. And I think for two reasons. One is that this reassertion of American power scares a lot of allies. And so, even the center-left, left-wing governments in Latin America, like Lula in Brazil, they spoke out and whatever, but they're not going really on a rampage. Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico has to worry that she might be next in line. And Trump threatened Petro in Colombia. And so that very reassertion of American power, I think, has intimidated or kind of, if you wish, coercively moderated the reaction inside Latin America. Trump, of course, I don't know whether it's attention deficit or a brilliant strategy, immediately moved to Greenland so the Europeans have something to worry about there rather than getting involved in Venezuela. So in some sense, American power, I think, has muted reaction among the allies, at least in the short run. What you think in the long run is probably like, OMG, this is awful. The other reason why I think the reaction has been muted is that Maduro was such an awful dictator. I mean, human rights violations, corruption. I mean, he had indictments not only from the US, but from the International Criminal Court. The head of the Organization of American States at the time asked the ICC for an indictment of Maduro. And not only was he, morally just awful, but utterly incompetent. I mean, who in human history has destroyed a country as much as Maduro did during his 13 years in power? So who wants to defend Maduro? You know what I mean? You can say, well, the United States shouldn't have intervened, but do you want to look like sort of siding with, defending, one of the worst leaders that we can think of in recent decades?
Of course. I mean, this is the challenge, right? That one can be very angry about the U.S. intervention if you're sitting in Brasilia, but you don't want to look like you're defending Maduro.
you see the two facets again. You see the realist thing, other countries are intimidated by American power, and you see the idealist streak. The United States chose a target that deserved its punishment. You see exactly that, again, those two facets of kind of realist power assertion and idealist going after the bad guys. Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. Now, on this point of realism, do you see large countries in the region like Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Colombia to some extent, do you see them in a way working closely together to combat U.S. intervention now? Should we view, for example, Kurt, the Mercosur free trade agreement that was just signed with Europe as a way of pushing back on the United States?
Definitely. You think of European Union agreement that had been lingering and languishing and being in negotiation for 25 years, and it just couldn't break the resistance and deadlock and whatever. And I think the reason why that finally got signed is, kind of, if you wish, some sort of soft balancing against the United States. So that would be an instance of that. In Latin America, I haven't seen any I don't know, like coordination, I don't know what you would want to call it, alliance formation, partly because, of course, the ideological divisions. So you mentioned Argentina, Milei was bailed out by Trump a few months ago. He's not going to oppose what Donald Trump did in Venezuela. He's ideologically happy that Donald Trump booted out Maduro. And so, given that a number of Latin American countries governed by right-wing leaders who are ideologically have affinity with or alignment with Donald Trump, I think that is one big obstacle to any really coordinated Latin American response.
So where do we go from here, Kurt? What do you expect to see? Fortunately for us, you're not just a historian. I'm a historian. Zachary is a historian to some extent. You're a political scientist, so you're supposed to know the future as well. So where do you see things going, Kurt?
So when I think of political science, I don't use the term with a capital S, So this situation in Venezuela is highly unpredictable. It's very fluid. It's uncertain what will happen. It is uncertain what will happen in Venezuela. It's uncertain what will happen in the international system because Donald Trump is so highly unpredictable too, typical populism. So in the Venezuelan case, which will also affect American foreign policy, I think one of the biggest points of uncertainty is that by the constitution that Hugo Chavez himself pushed through in 1999, by the constitution, if the presidency is vacant and you have a transition to somebody else, there should be the convocation of new elections. And that would, of course, provide a very important opening for the democratic transition that Trump has shockingly marginalized and kind of pushed aside to get into the game. And that, if there were a real election, real competitive, that could cause a good amount of uncertainty, trouble, turmoil, especially if the Democratic opposition had a chance of winning, of course, especially if it won. And so how that will play out, the established power structure in Venezuela currently headed by Delcy Rodriguez has no interest in new elections. In some sense, Donald Trump has no interest, and they might well maneuver and collude in trying to avoid this. But, as you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the Venezuelan people are yearning for a new start. The opposition will do everything they can to push for elections. The Marco Rubio agenda in the US might want to have a regime change in Venezuela. And so how that will play out, I think, is one of the main sources of uncertainty, because if there is a contested competitive election, and if the opposition were to win and there's trouble and turmoil in Venezuela and protests and counter-protests and violence, that could really draw the United States into the domestic politics and, greatly change the equation and turn the Venezuelan case maybe more similar to the story in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so it's very unpredictable.
Right.
Unfortunately, political science hasn't come up with the general laws that we could confidently make any clear assertions about a case like Venezuela.
Right. What we certainly see are that there are high risks, but that we don't know what will happen. In closing, Zachary, I want to turn to you as one of many young people in the United States watching all of this unfold. How do you see your generation of Americans responding to this, responding to what looks so different, at least from the rhetoric of American foreign policy for so long, the rhetoric of open markets and freedom and democracy? Does this contradict that, or does this look like more of the same hypocrisy? How are people viewing this?
I think for some it's clear, and for many it's clear that this is something, at least to celebrate to the extent that Maduro is gone, that is obviously a positive development for those who have relatives or family or friends in Venezuela or who fled Venezuela, which is not a not insignificant number of people in the United States. But I think there's also a lot of concern that this could, draw the United States into a larger war. And I think for the moment, a lot of people, young and not young alike, are sort of waiting to see what happens. I think, obviously most hope that this does not draw the United States into a larger war with Venezuela or with, in the region in general. But I think a lot of the big questions that we raised today remain unanswered. So I think there is a degree of uncertainty, and certainly there's much greater fear of war in the region than there was before.
Right. I think that's a perfect note to close on. I think it summarizes so much of what Kurt has said so well, which is what we are witnessing is a set of not historically unprecedented developments, but a set of developments that have happened at very fast pace and have created a great deal of uncertainty for the people of Venezuela, for the leadership of Venezuela, and certainly for the United States and the world community. And this tension that Kurt has articulated so well between realism and idealism, it's very hard to see where we're going right now. And I think that's just one more reason why we're going to have to watch, pay close attention, and think about this in historical terms as we've done today. Kurt Weyland, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Zachary, thank you for your excellent questions as well. And thank you most of all to our loyal listeners and subscribers to our Substack for joining us for this week of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Scott Holmes.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week.
You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
See you next time.